The people who change your life rarely arrive looking powerful. Sometimes they arrive shivering in the snow. The wind howled across Maple Street hard enough to rattle every window in my little bakery, carrying sheets of snow that blurred the world beyond the glass into a sea of white. The clock above the pastry display read 10:43 p.m., nearly an hour after closing, but I was still wiping flour from the wooden counter because fresh bread deserved a clean kitchen before morning. My name is Grace Sullivan. I was 27 years old, plus-sized, perpetually exhausted, and completely convinced that my biggest problem that winter was figuring out how to keep the furnace running without falling behind on my mortgage. Life had taught me to expect ordinary struggles. It had never prepared me for extraordinary strangers. I switched off the final light in the kitchen and wrapped my thick wool coat around my shoulders before stepping outside. The cold hit me like opening a freezer door. My breath immediately turned into white clouds drifting through the darkness. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I locked the bakery door and pulled my knitted hat lower over my ears. The neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet. Most people had stayed home after the weather service warned everyone to avoid unnecessary travel. The only sounds were the wind and the distant hum of a snowplow somewhere across town. Then I heard something else. A cough. Barely audible. Almost swallowed by the storm. I froze. It came again. Weak. Ragged. Human. Every sensible instinct told me to keep walking, get into my old pickup truck, drive home, and forget whatever noise I'd heard. Living alone meant learning not to invite trouble. But my grandmother had always said that kindness wasn't supposed to be convenient. I followed the sound around the side of the building where snow had drifted nearly knee-high. At first I thought it was a pile of discarded coats buried against the brick wall. Then the pile moved. My heart jumped into my throat. A man lay partially covered in snow, one arm stretched toward the alley as though he'd tried to stand and simply run out of strength. He wore an expensive black overcoat that now looked almost gray beneath the frost. His dark hair was damp with melting snow, and despite the freezing temperature, there wasn't a single pair of gloves on his hands. The skin across his knuckles was pale from the cold. Even through the open collar of his shirt, I noticed intricate black tattoos climbing from his neck beneath the fabric, disappearing under his sleeves and along the backs of his hands. Whoever he was, he didn't look like someone who belonged behind a neighborhood bakery. He looked like someone from another world entirely. I knelt beside him carefully. "Sir," I whispered. His eyelids fluttered but didn't fully open. His breathing was steady, just painfully slow. "Can you hear me?" A faint nod. Barely enough to reassure me he was still conscious. I pulled off one glove and touched the back of his hand. It felt like ice. My pulse raced. Calling an ambulance seemed obvious, yet when I reached for my phone, his fingers wrapped weakly around my wrist. They weren't threatening. They were desperate. His lips moved before any sound came out. Finally, in a voice rough enough to disappear beneath the wind, he murmured, "No hospital." I stared at him. "You're freezing." He closed his eyes again. "Please." There was something about the way he said it. Not commanding, not dramatic, just tired, like someone who hadn't asked anyone for help in a very long time. I should have walked away. Every headline I'd ever read warned against trusting strangers. Every crime documentary would have called me unbelievably naive. But compassion has a strange way of overpowering fear. I unlocked the bakery again, dragged the old delivery cart outside, and with more effort than I thought possible, managed to help him onto it. He was taller than 6 feet, solidly built, yet he barely resisted as I slowly pulled him through the back entrance. The warmth inside wrapped around us instantly. I locked every door behind us before guiding him toward the tiny apartment above the bakery where I lived. Each step up the narrow staircase felt impossible, but somehow we reached the living room. I eased him onto the couch, piled every blanket I owned over him, and hurried to warm chicken broth on the stove. When I returned, his eyes had opened for the first time. They were an impossible shade of steel gray, calm despite everything. He looked around the room with quiet caution before meeting my gaze. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then his eyes drifted toward the family photographs on my bookshelf, the worn furniture, the half-finished knitting project beside my chair, and finally back to me. His voice was still barely above a whisper. "Why?" I blinked. "Why what? Why help me?" I smiled before I could stop myself. "Because someone should." He studied me as though I'd answered in a language he'd never heard before. Then, After another long silence, he closed his eyes and whispered 6 words that I wouldn't truly understand until the following morning. You shouldn't have saved me. Morning arrived with unexpected silence. The storm had finally surrendered, leaving fresh snow sparkling beneath a pale winter sun that spilled through my kitchen window. I woke before my alarm, suddenly remembering the stranger asleep on my couch. For one terrifying second, I wondered if he had disappeared during the night. Instead, I found him sitting upright beside the window, wrapped in one of my old blankets, quietly watching the empty street below. The steaming mug of coffee I had left on the table sat untouched. His posture was perfectly straight despite the exhaustion still visible in his face. The tattoos climbing across his neck disappeared beneath the collar of the plain gray sweater I had found in my late father's closet. Somehow, even wearing borrowed clothes, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never asked permission to enter any room. He turned as I stepped into the living room. "Good morning," I said carefully. His eyes settled on me for a moment before he answered. "Good morning." His voice sounded stronger than it had the night before, though it still carried the rough edge of fatigue. "How are you feeling?" I asked while placing a plate of warm cinnamon rolls on the coffee table. He looked at the food before looking back at me. Alive. It was the closest thing to gratitude I expected from a stranger. I smiled anyway. That is usually a good place to start. For the first time, the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. It vanished almost immediately, but I caught it. We ate quietly. He spoke little, answering only simple questions. His name, he finally admitted, was Adrian. No last name. No explanation. When I asked whether someone might be worried about him, he calmly replied, "They are already looking." I assumed he meant family or friends. I had no idea how true those words really were. Around 8:30, he stood, folded the blanket with surprising care, and placed it neatly on the couch. "Thank you," he said. "You owe me nothing," I replied. I was only helping someone who needed a warm place for one night. His expression changed, almost as if those words carried more weight than I understood. Before he could answer, an unfamiliar sound rolled through the neighborhood. At first it resembled distant thunder. Then it grew louder. Engines. Lots of engines. Adrian slowly turned toward the window. His shoulders relaxed for the first time since I had found him. Curious, I pulled back the curtain. My heart nearly stopped. Black sport utility vehicles stretched down both sides of the street farther than I could see. Their polished exteriors reflected the morning sunlight like an endless wall of dark glass. The first vehicles stopped directly in front of the bakery. Then another, and another. Doors opened almost in perfect unison. Men wearing tailored black coats stepped onto the snow with disciplined precision. Every movement was coordinated, calm, silent. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Someone across the street dropped a newspaper into the snow without realizing it. The entire block had frozen. I looked back at Adrian. He had not moved. One man approached the front door, removed his gloves, and knocked exactly 3 times. Before I could react, Adrian spoke in the same calm voice he had used all morning. "You may answer." I opened the bakery door with trembling hands. The man standing outside appeared to be in his early 40s, with silver beginning to touch his dark hair. The moment he saw Adrian standing behind me, his entire expression changed. He lowered his head respectfully. "Boss," he said quietly. Every person outside followed his example. Hundreds of heads bowed at the same time. The sight was almost unreal. Adrian stepped forward. "Victor, we have been searching all night," the older man replied. "Everyone is safe. The situation has been contained." Adrian nodded once before asking his next question. "Was anyone harmed here?" Victor glanced at me, then back to Adrian. "No, boss." Adrian's voice became firm without becoming loud. "It stays that way. This woman showed me kindness when she believed I was nobody. From this moment forward, no one frightens her. No one disturbs her. No one enters this street without my permission." Victor answered immediately. "Understood." Adrian turned toward me. "Grace, I apologize for bringing this to your door." I stared at the endless line of vehicles filling my quiet little street. "Who are you?" For several seconds, he simply held my gaze. Then he answered with complete honesty. "A man whose world is much louder than yours." Before I could ask another question, he reached into his coat pocket, placed a small silver bakery key on the counter beside the register, and quietly said, "I hope your world stays exactly the way it is." Then he walked outside. Every vehicle remained perfectly still until Adrian entered the first one. Only then did the convoy begin moving, disappearing as smoothly as it had arrived, leaving behind fresh tire tracks in the snow and an entire neighborhood wondering whether they had just witnessed history or a dream. The bakery should have returned to normal after that unbelievable morning, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Customers came in talking about the endless line of black sport utility vehicles they had seen parked outside my little shop. Some insisted they belonged to a foreign diplomat. Others guessed a movie had been filmed overnight. I smiled politely, served fresh coffee and warm cinnamon rolls, and pretended I knew no more than they did. Inside, however, my thoughts refused to settle. Every time I looked at the couch upstairs, I remembered the man with frost on his coat, intricate tattoos climbing across his neck and hands, and those impossible gray eyes that seemed both tired and completely alert. Adrian had entered my life like the snowstorm itself, sudden and impossible to ignore, then vanished before I could understand who he really was. 3 days passed. Winter settled quietly over Maple Street again, and I convinced myself that extraordinary moments belonged to extraordinary people, not to someone like me. By Friday afternoon, the bakery was filled with the comforting smell of fresh sourdough and vanilla. Children pressed their hands against the glass display, while parents debated which cookies to buy. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop next door stopped by for her usual blueberry muffin. Life felt reassuringly familiar. Then a black luxury sedan parked across the street. It remained there for nearly 10 minutes before anyone stepped out. The driver wore a dark overcoat and carried himself with the same calm discipline I remembered from that morning. He entered the bakery alone, removed his leather gloves, and offered a respectful nod. "Miss Sullivan?" he asked. "That is me. My name is Victor Romano." I recognized him immediately as the man who had greeted Adrian with a bowed head. The bakery suddenly felt much smaller. Victor placed a cream-colored envelope on the counter with careful precision, almost as though it contained something fragile. "Mr. Adrian Moretti asked me to deliver this personally." So now I finally knew his full name. Adrian Moretti. The name somehow suited him. Elegant, quiet, heavy with stories I could not imagine. I hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on thick stationery. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost old-fashioned. "Thank you for saving my life. Please allow me to repay your kindness. Whatever this bakery needs, consider it done. If repairs are necessary, they will be completed. If debts exist, they will disappear. If expansion is your dream, I will make it possible. Kindness should never leave a person with less than they had before. Adrian Moretti." My eyes drifted toward Victor. This cannot be serious. Mr. Moretti is always serious. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. "Then please thank him for me." Victor waited politely. "There is more?" I asked. He expected you might refuse. I could not help laughing softly. He knows me better than I thought. Victor almost smiled. "He said you would believe helping people is not something that should be purchased." I leaned both hands against the wooden counter. "Because it is not." Victor remained silent. I continued before I lost my courage. "Please tell Mr. Moretti that I did not bring him inside because I expected money. I did not know who he was. I only knew someone was freezing. If tomorrow another stranger needed help, I would do exactly the same thing." The bakery grew unusually quiet. Even the customers seemed farther away. Victor looked at me with genuine curiosity, as though my answer surprised him. "Miss Sullivan, very few people would decline this opportunity. Then perhaps more people should remember what kindness actually means." He nodded slowly. "I will deliver your words exactly as you said them." As he turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. "May I offer one piece of advice?" "Of course." "The world Mr. Moretti lives in rarely forgets those who leave an impression." Before I could ask what that meant, he stepped outside and disappeared into the waiting sedan. I stood alone behind the counter holding Adrian's letter, wondering why refusing an extraordinary reward somehow felt far more important than accepting it. Somewhere across the city, a man whose body carried tattoos from his neck to his hands, whose name caused hundreds to stand at attention, was learning that for the first time in many years someone had looked at him without fear, without ambition, and without asking for anything in return. Neither of us realized that the simplest conversation of our lives had already begun changing both of our futures. The following week slipped by with the quiet rhythm I had always loved. Every morning, I unlocked the bakery before sunrise, mixed dough while the town was still asleep, and watched the first customers arrive wrapped in thick winter coats with sleepy smiles and cold hands searching for warm coffee. I told myself that Adrian Moretti belonged to another life, one far removed from flour-covered aprons and handwritten orders taped beside an old cash register. Yet small things began happening that refused to fit inside ordinary explanations. The broken streetlight outside my bakery, the one the city had ignored for nearly 2 years, was suddenly replaced overnight. The cracked sidewalk that customers constantly complained about was repaired before the weekend. Even the loose front step that I had planned to fix myself disappeared beneath fresh concrete before I could call a contractor. Everyone in the neighborhood celebrated the improvements. I simply wondered why they had all happened at exactly the same time. Then there was the old furnace. Every winter it rattled loudly enough to wake me upstairs. One freezing Tuesday afternoon, it suddenly stopped working altogether. I sighed, grabbed my phone, and began searching for repair companies while apologizing to customers for the chilly dining area. Less than 15 minutes later, a heating technician knocked on my door carrying a brand new replacement unit. I frowned. I have not scheduled an appointment. The man checked his paperwork. The work order was prepaid this morning. By whom? He glanced at the invoice. It only says the client requested complete privacy. I thanked him politely, but declined the installation. The poor technician looked genuinely confused. Miss, everything has already been paid for. Then whoever paid should receive a refund. He left shaking his head, probably convinced I had lost my mind. Later that evening, I carried another basket of unsold bread toward the community shelter a few blocks away. I had done that every Tuesday for years. My grandmother believed good bread should never be wasted when someone nearby was hungry. As I crossed the street, I noticed the same dark sedan parked half a block away. It had been there the previous afternoon, too. I could not see the driver's face through the tinted windows, but the engine quietly started the moment I continued walking. It stayed several car lengths behind until I reached the shelter, then disappeared before I could get a closer look. The same thing happened again on Thursday, and again on Saturday. At first, I wondered if I was imagining it. By the following Monday, I was certain I was not. Someone was watching me. The realization should have frightened me. Instead, it left me strangely curious because nothing bad ever happened while that sedan was nearby. One snowy evening, I finished closing the bakery nearly an hour later than usual after helping a young couple choose desserts for their engagement party. My arms were full of empty boxes as I stepped outside. Before I reached the alley, a loud cracking sound echoed above me. I looked up just in time to see a thick tree branch snap beneath the weight of fresh snow. Before I could react, someone called out from across the street. Miss Sullivan. I instinctively stepped backward. The heavy branch crashed onto the sidewalk exactly where I would have been standing a heartbeat earlier, sending snow into the air like white dust. My heart pounded as I stared at the shattered wood. The driver from the dark sedan hurried over. It was Victor. He wore the same composed expression as always, though his breathing suggested he had moved faster than he normally allowed himself to. Are you hurt? He asked. I slowly shook my head. No. He looked at the fallen branch before meeting my eyes. Good. I folded my arms against the cold. Have you been following me? Victor remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he answered with complete honesty. Watching over you is a better description. Because Adrian asked you to? He gave a small nod. He believes kindness deserves protection, especially when it asks for nothing in return. I looked around the quiet street. I do not need bodyguards. We know. Then why? Victor smiled gently, almost sadly. Because Mr. Moretti has spent most of his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. You are the first person who expected absolutely nothing. Some gifts are too rare to leave unprotected. Before I could argue again, he walked back toward the waiting sedan. The vehicle disappeared into the snowy evening as quietly as it had arrived, leaving me standing beneath the glowing streetlight, wondering whether the greatest act of kindness I had ever offered someone had quietly become the reason another person refused to let anything happen to me. Winter settled comfortably over Maple Street, but somewhere beyond the quiet rhythm of my bakery, another story had already begun unfolding without me. I noticed it first in the smallest details. People I had never met suddenly wandered into the shop asking unusual questions. One customer wanted to know how long I had owned the building. Another casually asked whether I lived upstairs alone. A delivery driver I had never seen before seemed oddly interested in my closing hours instead of where to unload his boxes. None of the conversations felt threatening. They simply felt wrong. Every instinct told me that strangers were collecting pieces of a puzzle, and somehow I was standing at its center without understanding why. I tried convincing myself I was overthinking everything until one snowy Friday evening when an unfamiliar man entered the bakery just before closing. He looked to be in his late 30s, dressed in an expensive charcoal coat with polished shoes that had never belonged on streets covered in slush. His smile was polite, almost rehearsed. "You are Grace Sullivan?" he asked. "Yes." He glanced around the nearly empty bakery before ordering a cup of black coffee. He never touched it. Instead, he studied every photograph hanging on the wall, every family recipe framed beside the register, every detail of the room as though memorizing it. "Business seems good," he said casually. "Good enough. You have been here long." "Almost 6 years." He nodded slowly. A woman living alone can become attached to familiar places. Something inside me tightened. This neighborhood has always been kind to me. Kindness is rare. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, especially when powerful people become interested. Before I could ask what he meant, the front door opened again. The small bell above it chimed softly. Victor Romano stepped inside, snow dusting the shoulders of his black coat. He did not raise his voice. He did not appear angry. Yet the atmosphere inside the bakery changed instantly. The stranger looked toward Victor, and the practiced smile disappeared from his face. "The bakery is closing," Victor said calmly. "I believe your coffee is finished." The man stood without argument. As he walked past Victor, neither of them spoke another word, but something silent passed between them that I could not explain. The stranger left. Victor remained by the entrance until the black sedan outside slowly pulled away from the curb. Only then did he turn back toward me. "Are you all right?" he asked. Who was he? Victor hesitated. Someone asking questions that should not concern him. I crossed my arms. "Questions about me?" He nodded once. "Why?" Victor looked toward the frosted window before answering. "Because there are people who spend their lives trying to understand Mr. Moretti. They search for weaknesses. They search for patterns. Recently, they discovered one unusual event. Their employer disappeared for one winter night and returned unharmed the following morning. My stomach dropped. They found me. They found your bakery," Victor corrected gently. "That is enough." I looked around the little shop my grandparents had once dreamed of owning. The shelves, the wooden tables, the smell of fresh bread cooling behind the counter. Everything suddenly felt fragile. I never asked to become part of his world. Mr. Moretti knows that. Victor reached inside his coat and handed me a small business card. Only one phone number appeared beneath Adrian's name. Nothing else. He hopes you never need to use it. And if I do? Victor's expression remained calm. Someone will answer immediately. I slipped the card into my apron pocket, uncertain whether accepting it was wise. After Victor left, I finished cleaning in silence. Snow continued falling outside, soft and peaceful, covering the sidewalks in fresh white blankets. I switched off the lights one by one before climbing the narrow staircase to my apartment. Halfway up, I paused beside the window overlooking the street. Across the road, another unfamiliar sedan had stopped beneath the new streetlight. It remained there only a few seconds before driving away the moment it noticed another dark vehicle approaching from the opposite direction. Hidden movements. Silent watchers. Invisible lines crossing through my ordinary life. For the first time since Adrian had walked out of my bakery, I realized that kindness sometimes carried consequences no one could predict. And somewhere beyond the quiet snowfall, a man whose tattooed hands had once trembled from the cold was already making certain those consequences would never reach my front door alone. The phone number Adrian had given me stayed tucked inside my apron pocket for nearly 2 weeks. I never called it. Some mornings I almost forgot it was there until my fingers brushed against the thick business card while reaching for my order pad. It became a quiet reminder that somewhere beyond my simple routine existed a world I still did not understand. The bakery remained busy as winter festivals brought more visitors into town. Children laughed around the cookie display while families ordered pies for weekend dinners. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. Underneath, however, I noticed something changing inside myself. I had begun looking over my shoulder when locking the front door at night. I found myself recognizing the same unfamiliar vehicles parked several blocks away before quietly disappearing. They never approached. They never spoke to me. They were simply there, like distant shadows that arrived before sunset and vanished before dawn. One evening, after closing, I carried 2 large bags of leftover bread to the community shelter. Snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the streetlights, and the air smelled clean enough to make every breath sting. The shelter director greeted me with his usual warm smile before pointing toward a corner table where several families shared hot soup. Watching children laugh over fresh bread reminded me why I had never regretted staying in Maple Street instead of chasing a larger career somewhere else. As I stepped back outside nearly an hour later, I noticed Victor waiting beside the familiar black sedan. He was not standing like a bodyguard. He looked more like someone carrying news he had been debating whether to deliver. "Good evening, Miss Sullivan," he said. "Good evening, Victor." We stood quietly while snow settled across the sidewalk. Finally, I asked the question that had lived in my mind since the morning Adrian disappeared from my apartment. Why was he out there alone that night? Victor lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes even powerful men become tired." I frowned. "Tired enough to walk into a blizzard?" He let out a slow breath. "Mr. Moretti lost someone many years ago during a winter storm. His younger sister." I remained silent. "She became stranded during heavy snowfall while he was away handling business. By the time he reached her, it was too late. He has blamed himself every day since." The cold suddenly felt heavier. "He never told me any of that." "He rarely tells anyone." Victor looked toward the falling snow. "Every year, when the anniversary comes, he disappears for one night. No security, no meetings, no phone calls. We search until he returns." I remembered Adrian sitting quietly beside my window, staring into the snow with eyes that seemed older than the rest of him. Suddenly that silence made heartbreaking sense. "He wanted to be alone," I whispered. Victor nodded. "Until you found him." I wrapped my coat tighter around myself. "I did not save his life because he was important." "Exactly," Victor replied softly. "That is why he cannot forget you." His words lingered between us long after neither of us spoke. "He believes everyone around him sees power first," Victor continued. "Money, influence, fear. You were the first person in many years who only saw someone freezing in the snow." My throat tightened unexpectedly. "I wish he would stop protecting me." Victor smiled with quiet understanding. "You may wish that. I am not certain he is capable of it." Before leaving, he reached into his coat and handed me a small white envelope. "He asked me to deliver this only if I believed you deserved to know the truth." Inside was a single photograph. Adrian stood beside a smiling teenage girl with bright gray eyes almost identical to his own. Snow covered both their shoulders as they laughed at something beyond the camera. On the back, written in the same careful handwriting as his letter, were only 8 words. She believed kindness could still change people. "I am trying." I stared at the photograph until the ink blurred slightly through unexpected tears. For the first time since that stormy night, Adrian Moretti no longer felt like an untouchable man surrounded by endless black vehicles and silent bodyguards. He felt like someone carrying a grief so heavy that even an empire could not lift it. And without realizing it, I had become the first person to remind him that not every winter had to end with someone being left alone in the cold. The photograph never left my kitchen table. Every morning before opening the bakery, I found myself looking at the smiling young girl standing beside Adrian, wondering how someone who had lost so much could still choose gratitude over bitterness. His note echoed in my mind every day. She believed kindness could still change people. "I am trying." Those words felt heavier than any promise money could ever buy. A week later, just after sunrise, I unlocked the bakery and found a familiar black sedan parked quietly across the street. Victor stepped out carrying no envelope, no message, and no guarded expression. Instead, he simply asked, "Would you be willing to meet Mr. Moretti?" I looked at the line of customers already beginning to form outside my door. "Here." Victor nodded. "Where you feel comfortable." I hesitated only a moment before answering. "Tomorrow morning, before opening." Victor smiled with genuine relief. "He will be here." The next morning arrived wrapped in another blanket of soft snow. At exactly 7 o'clock, Adrian walked through my bakery door alone. No convoy, no bodyguards, no expensive overcoat this time. He wore a dark wool sweater beneath a simple winter jacket, although the intricate tattoos still climbed above the collar and disappeared beneath the sleeves covering his powerful arms. He looked healthier than the man I had found in the alley, but his gray eyes still carried that same quiet sadness. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I poured 2 cups of fresh coffee and placed one in front of him. "You still drink it too slowly," I said with a small smile. The corner of his mouth lifted. "You remembered. You left quite an impression." Silence settled comfortably between us, broken only by the soft hum of the ovens warming behind the kitchen wall. Adrian finally looked around the bakery before speaking. "Nothing has changed. I worked very hard to keep it that way." He nodded thoughtfully. "I know." I folded my hands around my coffee mug. "Victor told me about your sister." Adrian's eyes lowered toward the table. He did not seem surprised. He should not have. I am glad he did. He remained quiet for a long moment before speaking in a voice barely louder than the furnace. "She believed every person deserved another chance, even people who had never earned one." His fingers rested lightly against the warm mug. Black ink wound across his hands like living memories. After she was gone, I stopped believing that. I looked directly into his eyes. "Then why are you trying again?" He met my gaze without hesitation. "Because one woman opened her door to a stranger she did not know." I smiled gently. "No, I opened my door to someone who was cold." Adrian let out the faintest laugh, the first genuine one I had ever heard from him. It transformed his entire face. "You always simplify everything. Maybe because people complicate enough already." He leaned back slightly. "Grace, I can protect you from almost anything." I shook my head before he could continue. "That is exactly what I wanted to talk about." His expression became attentive. "You do not need to protect me because I helped you one night." "I disagree." "Adrian," I spoke softly but firmly, "if you really want to honor your sister, then do not spend your life protecting only one person who happened to be kind. Protect people because they deserve it. Help strangers because someone once helped you. Let what happened that night change more than just my street." He stared at me in complete silence. I could almost see those words settling somewhere deep inside him. Finally, he asked, "Do you really believe one choice can change a person?" I thought of my grandmother, of warm bread shared with neighbors, of one freezing man lying in the snow behind my bakery. I believe every life changes because of ordinary moments that seemed unimportant at the time. Adrian slowly stood and walked toward the front window overlooking Maple Street. Snow drifted gently beneath the morning light while children waited with their parents outside the nearby school. He watched them for several long seconds before quietly saying, "Perhaps I have been protecting the wrong things." I joined him beside the window. Neither of us spoke again until the church bell rang across town. Then Adrian looked at me with an expression calmer than I had ever seen before. "Thank you, Grace." "For what?" "For reminding me that strength is measured by the lives you lift, not by the power you hold." As he stepped outside into the falling snow, I realized that the man leaving my bakery was not the same man I had carried inside weeks earlier, and somehow neither was I. The last snowfall of the season arrived without warning, covering Maple Street in a quiet blanket of white that softened every rooftop and sidewalk. Business had finally begun slowing after the holiday rush, giving me enough time to sit by the front window with a fresh cup of coffee while cinnamon bread cooled behind the counter. For the first time in weeks, I felt peaceful. Then I noticed something unusual. The familiar black sedan parked across the street had not moved all morning. Victor remained inside, reading something on a tablet instead of watching the bakery. It was the first time I had ever seen him appear distracted. Moments later, another unfamiliar luxury sedan rolled slowly past the storefront. It did not stop. It simply continued toward the intersection before disappearing around the corner. 5 minutes later, it returned. Then it passed again. My stomach tightened. It reminded me of the stranger who had asked too many questions several weeks earlier. Before I could think any further, the bell above my bakery door chimed. Adrian stepped inside wearing a charcoal overcoat lightly dusted with snow. His tattooed neck disappeared beneath a dark scarf, but the intricate ink along the backs of his hands remained visible as he removed his leather gloves. His expression was calm until he noticed the concern on my face. "What happened?" he asked. I nodded toward the window. "That car has driven by 3 times." Adrian glanced outside only once. The warmth disappeared from his eyes, replaced by the quiet focus I had never witnessed this closely before. He reached into his pocket, but stopped before touching his phone. Instead, he looked back at me. I remembered our conversation from only days before. Protect people because they deserve it, not because of me. He slowly lowered his hand. Would you trust me? He asked. Yes. Then stay here. He stepped outside alone. Through the bakery window, I watched him cross the snow-covered sidewalk with measured confidence. Victor immediately left the parked sedan and joined him. They exchanged only a few quiet words before both men looked toward the approaching vehicle. The luxury sedan slowed near the curb but never stopped. After several long seconds, it continued driving until it disappeared completely. Adrian remained standing in the falling snow, watching until it was gone. He did not chase it. He did not raise his voice. He simply waited. A few minutes later, he returned inside, brushing snow from his coat. Is everything all right? I asked. He nodded. It will be. I folded my arms. You are not telling me everything. He smiled faintly. No. I am choosing not to involve you in burdens that belong to me. I walked closer until we stood only a few feet apart. That is not the same thing. Adrian looked down for a moment before speaking. Some people expected me to answer fear with fear. Today they expected the same. His gray eyes met mine again. Instead, I remembered what you said. And what did I say? That strength is measured by the lives you lift. His voice grew quieter. Not every victory requires someone to lose. The bakery fell silent except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock. Adrian reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded sheet of paper. It was a property deed. Across the top was the address of an abandoned community center on the east side of town. I was going to purchase another building for business, he said. Instead, I bought this. I looked at him in confusion. Why? It will become a winter shelter. Free meals, warm beds, medical care. Anyone who needs it will be welcome. My eyes widened. That was your decision? He nodded. No one has ever told me to build something instead of defending something. I could not stop smiling. Your sister would have been proud. Adrian looked toward the snow falling outside the bakery window. For the first time since I had met him, the sadness in his face seemed lighter, as though he had finally placed part of its weight down. I hope so, he whispered. Before leaving, he turned back one last time. Grace. Yes. The night you opened your door, I believed the world had nothing left to offer except regret. He paused with one hand resting on the doorknob. Now I find myself wondering how many other doors have never been knocked on simply because no one believed kindness would answer. As he disappeared into the quiet snowfall, I realized that the greatest change had never been the convoy of black vehicles or the invisible protection surrounding my bakery. The greatest change was watching one man slowly replace the walls around his heart with windows that finally let light back in. 1 year passed more quietly than I ever imagined possible. Seasons changed, snow melted into spring rain, flowers returned to Maple Street, and my little bakery somehow became busier than it had ever been. Every Saturday morning there was a line stretching onto the sidewalk before sunrise. Families came for cinnamon rolls. Children came for oversized cookies. Travelers stopped because someone had told them there was a bakery where every unsold loaf of bread still found its way to people who needed it most. Some stories spread because they were exciting. Others spread because they reminded people that kindness still existed. I preferred the second kind. Across town, the old abandoned community center had become something completely different. Fresh paint covered the worn brick walls. Warm lights glowed through windows that had once been boarded shut. Families found temporary shelter there during the coldest nights of winter. Volunteers served hot meals every evening. Doctors donated their time once a week. Local businesses quietly contributed supplies without asking for recognition. No grand sign carried Adrian Moretti's name above the entrance. In fact, most visitors never learned who had paid for the renovations. That was exactly how he wanted it. Every few weeks, Adrian visited the bakery before opening. Never with a convoy. Never with unnecessary attention. Sometimes he helped carry heavy bags of flour into the kitchen. Sometimes he quietly sat near the window drinking coffee that still cooled faster than he drank it. He always insisted mine tasted better than coffee served anywhere else. I always replied that was because he finally remembered to drink it while it was hot. Those mornings became something neither of us ever tried to define. They simply belonged to us. Victor occasionally joined us. Although he always claimed he was only stopping by because the cinnamon rolls were impossible to refuse. Even he laughed more often now than when I had first met him. One snowy afternoon, near the anniversary of the night we met, Adrian asked whether I wanted to see something. We drove together to the community shelter after closing the bakery. Children filled the recreation room building puzzles, while volunteers handed out bowls of homemade soup. Elderly couples rested in comfortable chairs beside a fireplace that had not existed a year earlier. A young mother thanked one of the volunteers for winter coats that perfectly fit her children. No one recognized Adrian. They simply smiled politely as another visitor walked through the building. He stood quietly near the entrance for several minutes, watching strangers help strangers. "This is your doing," I whispered. Adrian slowly shook his head. "No." He looked toward the families laughing together. This started the night someone believed a freezing stranger deserved a warm place to sleep. I smiled softly. One person cannot build all of this. He looked at me with calm certainty. "No, but one person can remind another what they were meant to become." As we prepared to leave, a little boy ran toward the front door carrying a drawing made with bright crayons. He held it up proudly for everyone nearby to see. The picture showed a small bakery covered in snow with a smiling woman standing beside a tall man wearing a winter coat. Above them, written in uneven letters, were 4 simple words. "Kindness makes winter warmer." Adrian stared at the drawing longer than anyone else. Then he quietly knelt beside the boy and thanked him as though he had just been handed something priceless. During the drive back to Maple Street, neither of us spoke very much. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. When we reached the bakery, gentle snow had already begun falling beneath the streetlights exactly as it had 1 year before. Adrian looked toward the narrow alley where I had first found him and let out a quiet breath. "I used to think power meant never needing anyone," he said. "Now?" I asked. He smiled with a warmth I had never believed possible. The night I first saw him lying in the snow, his tattooed hands frozen against the cold. "Now I believe the strongest people are the ones brave enough to open a door before they know who is standing outside." I watched the snow settle across the empty sidewalk and realized that he had been right about one thing from the very beginning. That winter morning had changed both of our lives forever. Not because an empire had found my little bakery, not because hundreds of black vehicles had filled my quiet street, but because one ordinary choice, made without expecting anything in return, had quietly transformed 2 hearts and then reached far beyond them into the lives of countless people we would never even meet.